What is up, vinyl community? This is part 2 of Gimme 10 from Thrash history. I want to thank you guys for coming back and finishing up part 2. If you guys haven't seen part 1, I'm collaborating with John over at JohnDub78. He's got part 1 over at his channel. If you go check that out first and then come back here, that would be awesome. We've collaborated together to give you 10 from Thrash history. What we did was we identified some influential bands, some pioneering bands, and then basically the explosion of metal in the 80s, and we're right at that point right here. So we're going to pick up where we left off with the metal explosion.
Only a few short years after the kind of initial wave of thrash bands that we previously mentioned, the pioneering bands, there was just an explosion of thrash metal from not only in the US but really from all over the world. You can think basically between 85, 86, 87, kind of those 3 years, there was, thrash bands everywhere. And not only were there a ton of thrash bands, they were all releasing really, really strong albums that many of those albums are still regarded today as some of the best heavy metal albums ever made.
I feel like the second wave of thrash bands didn't get the advantage of being out of the gate first, but yet they are able to sit back, kind of watch, and build on things of their predecessors. And they also benefit from better production.
When you talk about the history of thrash metal, you have to mention Exodus and their seminal first album, Bonded by Blood. Absolutely an essential heavy metal album, not just a thrash metal album, but heavy metal album. Had Exodus released that album when it was recorded and ready to go in 1984, we all may be talking about Exodus as a member of the Big Five. But because of various things within the band and then within their record company, that album was delayed a full year, and so by the time it came out in 1985, it was just another thrash album that came out with a lot of other bands. So unfortunately for Exodus, that hurt them in their career early on as well, even though they were really there at the very beginning.
So my pick is Forbidden Evil. Now Forbidden forms in like 1985, so they're right there in the beginning of all of this, but yet they don't release an album, kind of like Testament, they don't release an album for like 3 years, and I think that hurt them. So take a look at their album, Forbidden Evil. Fantastic artwork. These guys are tight. We have Paul Bostaff on drums. I know he's now a Slayer, but this album is killer, and he's a large part of that. I mean, the speed will just run you over.
Interesting band that some of you may or may not have heard of is a band called Carnivore, and they were, again, an East Coast band, I believe New York. And Carnivore is famous because of their lead singer, Peter Steele, who of course went on to do Typo Negative. But Carnivore kind of took a tongue-in-cheek approach. They really didn't take themselves seriously, and if you listen to that album, while it is a great album, some of the songs, a lot of the lyrics are kind of silly in my opinion, but it is a good thrash album. So Carnivore was kind of in that Anthrax vein of things, not taking themselves seriously and kind of more fun-loving than most of the thrash bands were.
There was a lot of killer metal released in 1986, but I'm going to pick Master of Puppets because this tape was handed to me in junior high and was my gateway drug into all things heavy and fast. Once I listened to Metallica, I ended up going back through and discovering Ride the Lightning and Kill 'Em All, and a whole new world opened up for me.
The band Possessed is considered by some to be the very first death metal band, and their first record, Seven Churches, is also considered by many to be the first death metal record. However, if you listen to this record, I mean, it's a thrash record. It's basically, in my opinion, the record that kind of is the bridge the gap between thrash and heavy metal. The vocalist of Possessed was really one of the first guys to have that kind of guttural, growling vocals. But that first album, again, full-on thrash album, and it really is, it's a great album.
Now, Death Angel is one of my favorite thrash bands, and this album, Frolic Through the Park, follows up from their debut album, Ultraviolence. And there's so much going on this album. This is a killer thrash album.
Dave Mustaine is also considered by many to be one of the godfathers of thrash. His riffs, he wrote arguably the first thrash riffs with that first Metallica record. And one of the greatest thrash and heavy metal albums of all time, which really kind of pushed the boundaries of thrash. It's almost, technical. I think a lot of the technical death metal bands would cite this record as a big influence. Would be Megadeth's Rust in Peace, released in 1990. At the time of its release, and I remember when it first came out, I was in junior high, 1990, I was in like 8th grade, 7th or 8th grade, when that album came out, Rust in Peace. I was just blown away at the musicianship alone with Marty Friedman and Dave Mustaine. If you really listen to their guitar lines that they're playing, the riffs that they're playing, and some of the little melodies that Marty Friedman would play underneath, the standard riffs that Dave would play, it's just absolutely incredible, and definitely influenced, the more technical, even kind of proggy thrash or death metal bands that would come later. Rust in Peace, again, phenomenal album, and it's actually my favorite Megadeth album.
I think really Suicidal are pioneers of thrash with their debut album that was more hardcore than it was metal, but fast forward to How I Laugh and you've got a headbanging party for almost an hour. While the metal world was crumbling away, these bands stubbornly released albums against the tide.
Thrash metal basically just went back underground where it kind of started, and then of course glam metal disappeared from the face of the earth. I believe one of the great albums of 1990, thrash metal albums of 1990, is by a band called Prong, and their album Beg to Differ. Thrash album from front to back, no question about it. Prong, of course, is not generally considered to be a thrash metal band. I've heard them categorized as, of course, early on a crossover, hardcore punk crossover band, and then later kind of alternative metal, I guess is what they get classified as today. But in 1990, they released Beg to Differ, and that was a full-on thrash album, and it was a damn good one as well. Regardless of what was popular, they basically said, screw it, we're going to release the thrash album whether you like it or not. Highly recommended album, great album if you haven't heard it.
For my pick, I went with Sepultura AD, iconic cover, addictive riffs, and those of us seeking shelter from an oversaturated Nevermind world found it here in this album.
Heavy metal in general continued to see, some sort of success. They could tour, play, large festivals, large venues, whereas in the U.S. at the time it was, all grunge. Grunge and pop music. But a band like Kreator, who I mentioned early on as being kind of one of the pioneering bands from Germany, along with Sodom, they continued to release albums all throughout the 90s. In fact, they are still around today, and they still release records, and they are a highly influential band, not only in the thrash metal world, but they've influenced many a death metal band as well.
Kreator was an early pioneer thrash band from Germany, continued to carry the torch through the 90s, and still release albums today.
Their, of course, first album was Pleasure to Kill, fantastic record. So that's a good place to start with Kreator. If you're not familiar with them and you want to get into them, definitely start with that first one, Pleasure to Kill.
I went with Pantera because Pantera really connected the 90s to the 2000s for me. While hair bands were finishing their record deals and releasing Coda albums in 90, 91, Cowboys from Hell came out of nowhere and devastated my ears and my brain. Not a pure thrash band, I know, but neither was Metallica at this time, but it's in there, and so is the anger, the energy, and the attitude, and that's what I love about Pantera.
Hey, you got Dimebag and Vinnie Paul, and we're from Pantera!
Fortunately, thrash metal did not completely disappear from the music world like glam metal did. As I mentioned a couple times now, thrash metal, kind of went back underground, but there were a number of these, veteran bands who continued to release records. They had, kind of a tough period, tough stretch during the 90s, some of these veteran thrash bands, but they continued to release records, and they're still releasing records today. And, kind of one of the big bands. They're definitely, I'd say, the most influential band from the second wave of thrash metal bands, and that would be Testament. And Testament is one of my absolute favorite metal bands of all time. Love Testament. I love Chuck Billy. I think he's just an awesome frontman. And I love Alex Skolnick. As a guitar player, he is, just an unbelievable guitar player, and continues to influence generations of hard rock and heavy metal players. But yeah, Testament, they were kind of there at the tail end of the first wave, and then of course they released their first album in 1987, The Legacy.
I agree. Testament is right there in the beginning with Legacy. Not only that, they released great albums in the 90s, and they're still releasing albums up to today with Brotherhood of the Snake.
That's the good thing when you have artists who kind of stayed true to what they wanted to do. They didn't change with the trends, with the different music trends in the metal world as the 90s turned into the 2000s, and they just kept doing their thing. They've had various members leave, and the band was inactive for a few years, but they're back now and as strong as ever.
The veteran pick for me was really tough, but I went with Metal Church because they go all the way back to the roots of thrash. Now I know they're a mix of power and thrash, but they have outstanding albums all throughout the 80s, 90s, and also 2000s, and then their more recent album is 11. And Mike Howe, with him on vocals, those are my favorite albums except for Light in the Dark. But Mike Howe is back with Metal Church. They're sounding better than ever. They're my veteran pick. The 80s were a great time for heavy metal and heavy metal music, especially since the birth of thrash happened there. And I want to hang on to that as much as possible and not let it go. But I think if we want the genre to grow and not die out, we've got to welcome new fans into the fold, and we have to support new albums. New bands I think of right away are Havoc and Power Trip. Their second album, Nightmare Logic. When I dropped the needle on that and heard it for the first time, it had the same impact on me as listening to Slayer or Metallica for the first time. So my pick is Power Trip, Nightmare Logic. These guys are killer, they're very aggressive, and I think they will do a great job representing the genre going forward.
We just simply wanted to pick thrash albums that we believe were, had a part in the story of thrash from the very beginning all the way up through today. Thanks again, everyone, for watching our videos. We hope you enjoyed them.
Okay, that's it. Thank you for watching. If you haven't seen part 1, please head over to John's channel and do so. And if you feel like making a video, let's see your top 10 from thrash history.
Curious to see some of you, if you guys want to leave comments or maybe even make videos of your own. Let's see your 10 thrash albums.